Right, the Abominable Mercury then. In order to fulfill Aleister Crowley's commission to illustrate his Book of Thoth, Frieda Harris became his magical pupil, working her way diligently through the grades of the AA. Her studies were blended with her work on the tarot paintings, during the course of which she developed a deeply personal relationship with the god Mercury. In this talk, I will explore the development and various manifestations of Harris's relationship with the Trickster god and assess their impact on the creation of the Magus card, her personal life, and her magical development. For nearly 60 years, Harris conducted herself, as she laughingly described, as an exceedingly well-bred and bourgeoise lady with all the nice instincts of that section of real life. To counter the societal expectations of Lady Harris, the wife of the right Hon, she created her alter ego, Jesus Chutney, first adopted when she was mingling with surrealists in the 1920s Paris. Used initially as an alias when exhibiting her paintings, Jesus Chutney became her independent bohemian identity in correspondence, other writings, and even the telephone listing for her Richmond studio. Harris's playful sense of humour was not always appreciated by Crowley, especially in matters magical, and as we will see, she sometimes employed JC to convey serious issues amusingly to deflect a potentially hostile response. As I will argue, her anthropomorphizing of Mercury, both as a manifestation in her everyday life and as the source for the Magus card, caused genuine concern for Crowley, who believed of all the gods, Mercury is the easiest to offend, the hardest to propitiate. There are three strands to my narrative: the inception of Jesus Chutney, Harris's progression through the AA, and her burgeoning relationship with Mercury. Harris's education had been designed to equip her with the appropriate skills to find a suitable husband rather than a career. Even so, she left school a talented musician, reasonably fluent in French, and was already developing her skills as an artist. In 1927, her older son Jack was living in Paris, gaining business experience prior to joining the family firm. A friend had lent him an apartment in the artists' quarter, and Frieda joined him for an extended visit. By this time, the Surrealist movement was well established in the Parisian artistic community, and it is likely that Harris would have moved in the same circles. According to Jack, it was about that time that she began painting pictures under the name of Jesus Chutney. Her choice of name not only represents the anarchistic principles of Surrealism, it also reflects her mischievous sense of humour and ultimately became her personal identity. Her husband, Percy, believed she used the alias because as his wife she would have been dismissed as an amateur and accordingly disparaged. Jesus Chutney was the antithesis of an exceedingly well-bred and bourgeoise lady, an independent bohemian artist free to express themselves however they chose. She even painted his portrait, which was apparently tactfully removed from display at her 1932 exhibition at the Wertheim Gallery. According to one reviewer, it showed a behaloed, caprine-bearded figure with arms stretched out to suggested crucifixion, attired in shabby tweeds, a clay pipe in his mouth, and the neck of a bottle protruding from a pocket. Harris, like many of her contemporaries, was seeking for something other, something that could not be provided by conventional religion and society. However, it was not until July 1937, when Clifford Bax introduced her to Crowley, that she finally had the motivation to prioritize the aspirations of Jesus Chutney over the societal expectations of Lady Harris. By the following February, Harris was making preliminary sketches for the Book of Thoth and studying Crowley's magical writings. By the 3rd of May, Crowley was pleased to report she is now quite definitely a pupil, and on the 11th he recorded her vision's quite remarkably good. Accordingly, it was agreed she would affiliate to the OTO at the equivalent level to her pre-existing Masonic degree. She also joined the AA, adopting the magical motto of Saba, which is Hebrew for host. The AA is made up of 11 grades, mapped in ascending order against the Kabbalistic tree of life. Progress through these degrees is achieved through a one-to-one relationship between student and master. The lowest degree, probationer, 0 equals 0, sits outside the order and is designed to prepare the initiate for the neophyte grade, 1 equals 10. Progress through the degrees was not strictly formalised, and as master, Crowley would determine what Harris studied and when she was ready for initiation into the next grade. Nevertheless, specific topics are associated with each degree, and therefore, to some extent, Harris's progress can be charted through her correspondence and Crowley's diaries. Her magical studies were incorporated into the ongoing work on the tarot, as well as her domestic obligations, set against the backdrop of imminent war with Germany. Despite having received, as she put it, no education, Harris began to learn the Greek and Hebrew alphabets, the Kabbalah, and subsequently the I Ching, or as Crowley preferred to call it, the Yi King. Crowley studied the Yi avidly and consulted it daily, as well as for specific guidance on matters both magical and non-magical, believing as he did that all aspects of his life were part of the great work. In contrast to Crowley, Harris contextualizes magic and thelemic principles in her observations on everyday life. One such example is her account of visiting friends in Worthing on the point of starvation. She compares their circumstances to a dinner party she and Crowley are arranging and the extravagance involved. My law of thelema kicks at the situation, for my will is to spread my finances on the necessities of life, and I don't really hold with high living. This is almost certainly a dig at Crowley's extravagant lifestyle, couched in thelemic terminology. Harris's self-deprecating humour features throughout her correspondence with Crowley, such as including a cartoon of herself kneeling before the sun, captioned, "The Disciple, oh hell," in her 1938 Christmas greeting. It's not clear when Harris started her studies as neophyte, nor when she progressed to Zalator, in which the initiate is instructed in yoga and meditation techniques for posture and breath control. In October 1938, she jokes about a dawn meditation undertaken by someone she has commissioned to alter a bed, but it is not until 1944 that she mentions meditation as part of her early morning routine. However, there is definite evidence that indicates when Harris was preparing for the next grade, Practicus, 3 equals 8. This is aligned to the 8th Sephira, Hod, and the planet Mercury, and the student learns the Kabbalah, philosophical meditation, and one mode of divination, in Harris's case, the Yi King. Questions about the Tree of Life feature in her letters in late 1939, but she didn't start serious work on the Yi until the following year. As I said earlier, her initial focus was the tarot designs, and it was not until war was declared and Harris decamped to her studio in Chipping Campden that she could shut herself off from domestic distractions and focus entirely on her magical endeavours. Even then, her tranquility was broken by her husband's intermittent visits, leading her to lament to Crowley, "I wish I had not married Jupiter." According to Crowley, the Yi King was Harris's choice, of which he approved highly because it is the key to the kind of painting after which you were groping when I first met you. By August 1940, she had started reading about the Yi, although she found its complexities challenging from the outset, deeming herself unqualified to be its office boy. I try, but I can't make out why you think it is important, that I should strain every nerve to understand and remember all this. Where is the wisdom?" Harris had a major issue with divination, telling Crowley, "I don't want it, it does not interest me." However, Crowley dismissed her protests, explaining, "It is a method of rendering the mind lucid, opening up into the higher. For the aspirant, there must be nothing, however mean, insignificant, vile, and loathsome, that is not the voice of the Most High. Therefore, I want you to wring from it by the sweat of your brow its innermost meanings in terms of the absolute." In short, Crowley wanted to ensure that not only did Harris study the Yi, but she genuinely understood it. Crowley's diary transcript for the same date reads, "Wrote Frieda, re 8 equals 3. However, this grade is Magister Templi, which was only ever held by 3 people, Charles Stanfield-Jones, Leah Hirsig, and Crowley himself. Even though Crowley's diaries were transcribed by Kenneth Grant, who had a thorough understanding of Crowley's magic, I would contend that this is a transcription error and should read 3 = 8, or practicus. It was not only the ye that Harris struggled with. As she told Crowley, "I do not love Tahuti or any of the Egyptian deities. I try all the same." She also objected to what she deemed the unnecessary rules of the OTO. All these I seem to have attempted to put into practice all my life without the interference of what seems to be the dangerous element of an inquisition, or benevolent, or not, dictator. The inquisition to which she alludes could well be the examination required to advance between the individual degrees, thereby implying Crowley as a dictator. Harris continues in typical playful fashion, anthropomorphizing Thelema as a separate personality in the shape of a Miss Thelema, who is very precise, always wears white, and interferes with me and makes me work too hard, and I hate her. Human notwithstanding, it is clear Harris had genuine concerns about Thelema, telling Crowley, "I do not think the ritual of magic is much good to me. I seem to have to draw everything I want to understand." Despite her misgivings, Harris had committed herself to the OTO and AA, and she did her best to integrate magical practices into her everyday life. But as always, these had to be accommodated around her domestic obligations. The invocation gets forgotten, but I try. The discipline would do me a power of good. I can pull it off morning and night. I would like to work systematically, but I fancy I have a bit of karma to chew up about being a woman and the prey of the servant and the domestic side of life who peck at me. There are indications that having successfully achieved practicus, Harris started preparing for philosophus, which includes additional meditation practices, most noticeably instruction and examination in methods of meditation by devotion, or Bhakti Yoga. In Bhakti Yoga, the initiate selects a particular deity and develops a relationship with them, using a series of ceremonies and invocations as set out in Liber Astarte. It carries the following warning: this method is not so suitable for gods austere as Saturn or as intellectual as Thoth. The Egyptian Thoth was god of magic, writing, and wisdom, commonly depicted as an ibis-headed man or a baboon, also known as a cynocephalous ape. Thoth also acted as the messenger of the gods and corresponds to the Greek Hermes and Roman Mercury. Thus, in choosing Mercury, Harris chose to ignore this warning and, as I will argue, suffered the consequences accordingly. References to Mercury abound throughout Harris's correspondence with Crowley, not only as the Roman deity and the planet, but also as the embodiment of the magician or magus card in the tarot. It would appear that she was working on this design as early as September 1939, when she told Crowley, "I'm worried about Mercury. I can only see him as I've drawn him, not so tricksy as you seem to know him. However, I'll try. The fool mixes up with him more than I want." A month later she observed, "Mercury is fussing dreadfully." Mercury was clearly gaining significance in Harris's eyes, and there are many playful references referring to both the painting and the deity himself. Writing to tell Crowley about a broken wash basin, Harris begins, "Just imagine what happened. Mercury is in a very ape-like mood." In another letter, she jokes about not being able to work on the Magus card. "I can't do Mercury. I have invoked Jupiter to call him off, and he is coming to stay with me for 3 weeks. In other words, Percy is going to have another holiday." Mercury became the driving force behind the tarot paintings, to the extent of Harris believing he supported her endeavours to exhibit them in Oxford. Mercury is evidently wishing to hold it. Nicholson and Venn, High Street, Oxford, have offered me their gallery. However, the exhibition turned into a logistical nightmare at the same time as Crowley was going through yet another housing crisis, and again Harris attributed this to Mercury, who was prancing wildly, "I wish he would leave you a roof and me my repose of mind." In contrast, rather than joking about Mercury's possible influence on proceedings, when Nicholson and Venn reneged on their agreement to hold the exhibition, Crowley invoked Mercury all morning, turning everything that turned up into a mercurial symbol. I would argue that Harris's albeit playful affinity with Mercury was clearly established by the time she began her philosopher's studies, and it was inevitable that she would choose to develop a relationship with him through Bhakti Yoga, despite the caveat in Astarte. After the exhibition was over, Crowley and Harris agreed she would undertake a great magical retirement, for which Crowley provided instructions. However, due to post-exhibition fatigue, followed by various family crises, it was early July before Harris could isolate herself in Chipping Campden and start her preparations. My contention is that Crowley's instructions relate to the Astarte rituals in which Harris would seek unity with Mercury. I would also argue that she failed to complete the process properly, thus incurring Mercury's displeasure. My view is supported by a letter from Crowley to Ben Stubbins written the following year, in which he told him, Frieda would not invoke Mercury properly and got obsessed by the cynocephalus over a year ago now and has made blunder after blunder. The worst of it is that he will punish her most terribly. He has no human feelings at all. Truth is the one virtue that appeals to him. The Astarte ritual requires the most beautiful and perfect image of the chosen deity upon which the aspirant meditates. If the devotee can paint or carve the image themselves, it is all the better. Therefore, it is feasible that when Harris started work on a new version of the Magus painting in September 1941, it was for both Astarte and the Book of Thoth. Be that as it may, it is clear from her correspondence that Mercury was requiring a distinct persona, similar to her bohemian alter ego, Jesus Chutney. Harris found there were too many distractions in Chipping Campden, telling Crowley, "No time for Mercury yet. I feel he wants a special and private retreat." Harris finally set off for the Somerset seaside town of Minehead in November, with Mercury as her travelling companion. So strong was his influence, Harris rejected the first hotel because it was apparently run by policemen who blew whistles and marshalled you into meals, so I was sure Mercury would not like that. Accordingly, they settled on a vast and hideous edifice inhabited by dim beige ladies, securing a fourth-floor room with a sea view and room service breakfast. So here we are, Mercury and his humble servant. This last remark also harks back to Astarte, in which the philosophers in no wise neglect the service of a menial. However, despite the isolation, Harris delayed in finishing the painting, citing Jesus Chutney, of course, as an excuse. I understand from the messages JC sends me that he has embroiled himself with a person called Mr. Mercury, and that he cannot arrange matters to their mutual satisfaction for another week. Referring to Mercury in such familiar and facetious terms could be the sort of blunder Crowley was talking about, as well as her decision in 1942 to stage 2 consecutive exhibitions under her own auspices, without Crowley's knowledge or prior agreement. When Crowley visited the second show, he was forced to admit it was superb, everything exactly right, bar the Abominable Mercury. One could argue that in his displeasure, Mercury had denied Harris the inspiration she needed to do the Magus card justice. By this time, Harris's relationship with her husband had also deteriorated. Percy had ceased to visit Chipping Campden, and the couple did not resolve their differences until the following May. In contrast, Crowley and Harris were reconciled in a matter of months, and for Christmas he sent her the Jungitor mantra to appease Mercury for her. The mantra is an element of the Paris working in which both Mercury and Jupiter are invoked. Taking into account the ongoing problems in the Harris' marriage, the mantra had the potential to appease not only the insulted deity, but also Jupiter in the persona of the aggrieved Percy. Even though Crowley may have considered this inappropriate, Harris may well have believed that Jungitor could serve such a dual purpose. Harris persisted in trying to paint a Magus card worthy of Mercury, and even considered using magic to assist her. Crowley's diary of the 16th of June 1943 reads, "She may do a Magus based on the Paris working." I mentioned earlier her doubts about the ritual of magic because she needed to draw in order to understand. I would argue that as Harris's art and esotericism became more closely entwined, she finally found, as Crowley said, the key to the kind of painting after which she was groping when he first met her. The outcome of the ritual, if indeed Harris performed it, is a matter of conjecture. However, there are no further references to the Magus card in the available source material, which suggests the design had been agreed and finalized. Taking into account her misgivings about Thelema and the offence she may have caused to Mercury, one might ask whether she thought it worthwhile. The answer lies in one final manifestation of Mercury, that of the elemental mercury in the alchemical process. In November 1944, following the publication of the Book of Thoth, she wrote to Crowley, "As far as mercury is concerned, the alchemists would say we have attempted a mixture with impure gold, or mercury is not extracted with sufficient heat. Well, I tried, and so did you, and if we haven't made the philosopher's stone, I feel I have extracted something which is precious to me. I am painting, and have intervals of rare pleasure too." Harris had succeeded in extracting something which was precious to her, intrinsically linked to her art, exactly as Crowley had hoped, and ultimately, Mercury looked favourably on her endeavours. Thank you for your time.
Any questions?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I missed the beginning, so I'm sorry if you mentioned this, but I was always fascinated by the potential connection between projective geometry and Frieda Harris's work in the cards, especially in this last card that you showed. And I always wondered, to what extent is that, I never followed up on that sort of connection. I was just curious, to what extent was she interested in that and worked with even some of the Steiner's people on this and then used it in the cards?
Yes, she did. My impression is that the Anthropomorphised, that's one thing I can never say, Steiner's bunch wasn't for her, because she said the thing about George Adams was that he always absorbed spirituality through negation, and Harris believed that it should be a happy process, and it was just too bloody miserable. But the projective geometry, she actually said to Crowley, because Crowley had two issues. One was projective geometry was a load of old nonsense because it wasn't new at all, and he knew geometry better. He knew everything better than other people, but with geometry, he knew more about the mathematical side. So he thought that was nonsense, and he was also threatened by the anthroposophy. And she insists that it was to understand how to draw the geometry and the lemniscate so that she could actually get the geometry just right. And yes, it's throughout the cards, and it's also in some of her other drawings, so it's incredibly important. But she was no more into anthroposophy than she really was to Thelema. Once Crowley died, the main issue for her was to get the Book of Thoth and the cards published as an entity, but not to sort of promote Thelema. In fact, she even turned down a lecture tour in Canada because she felt that she wasn't right for the role. Absolutely. It was, she was absorbing, just like you, as magicians, you have your magical toolkit. She was having her magical esoteric art toolkit, and projective geometry was fundamental to that.
Any other questions?
Can you measure in any way Crowley and Frieda Harris's regard or disregard for Marseille as an influence as well?
Disregard, not necessarily. The basic principle, the original idea was to take the Marseille trumps and then come up with something appropriate for the pip cards. And Crowley said a lot of spiteful things about the Smith-Waite tarot, including the fact he didn't think it was appropriate to illustrate the minor arcana, that it should have been just simple stuff. So it needed to be as simple as possible. They were looking around the lines of sort of reimagining or representing the Marseille Tarot, which is fundamental to the Golden Dawn, Book T, etc. And then basically I think Frieda said, look, I've had this brilliant idea, why don't we just do the lot? After all, Pamela Coleman Smith did. I don't think she necessarily said that, but I'm pretty sure at some point they met. But so they thought what should have been a 6-month project ended up being 6 years. And Crowley actually said, that's never what I expected. I thought we could just get the whole thing out by Christmas. But it was so brilliant that you came up with this idea, and without you, you've actually managed to produce something that I've only seen in vision. So that, but yes, the Marseille was underneath it because, well, let's face it, it's basically near the beginning.
It had to be in some way. But I'm just trying to, from memory, trying to remember how much of a link is still in those cards. It's not much, really. There's some fundamental, perhaps, structural elements.
Yeah, structural elements there are, but obviously things get developed further. So if you think of the devil card, I made a joke to somebody yesterday about the fact it's virtually impossible to describe this without using my hands, but I'm not going to. But you have still got the central figure of a devil and a male and female character, or two human-type characters on the other side of it, and then the structure around it. With the priestess, you've still got a veil, you've still got pillars, you've still got the chariot in the basic structure, because if you think you start with the Marseille, you've got the wort and the pappus, and the developments from there, where they've kept the basic structure. There are all sorts of discussions about which way the kings are facing, but when you get to the court cards, well, I mean, Crowley's gone off into his own country there because he's taking the book T descriptions. He then writes comments about why he thinks it's a load of bollocks, even though he'd actually published it. About, I mean, why would you do this and why would you do that? And he thought, well, that's what you said. And then he's through all his sort of magical understanding, he's worked out how he wants to do it. And Frieda goes, all right, I'll do that. Which is why they had to be done so often. I mean, there wasn't just 8 Magus cards, there were also, 4 or 5 of quite a few of the others. And the princes gave her absolute hell.